Want tips on using poetry to improve your writing? Then this is a show for you. Hi, my name's Tonya Duncan Ellis. I'm a children's author and host of Write This, my author interview show. And today I'm pleased to welcome Leslea Newman, a poet and celebrated author who's written over 80 books. And she's going to come on and talk to us about poetry and ways that we can use it to improve our writing. So I'm sending her an invitation. This is her first time. So hopefully she can join us. I'm so happy to see all of you guys, and please get your questions ready for her. So she's here. Yeah.
Hey, we did it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining me. I am thrilled to have you here today and to talk to you and pick your brain about poetry and to give you an opportunity to share your work with everyone that is tuning in.
Great.
Yes.
I'm so happy. Finally, we figured out the technology.
We did it.
This is all new to me.
I've had so many things happen on the show. I need to have like a blooper show with different things because I've had one lady had a nosebleed when we were live and all kinds of different things have happened. So it's just part of being live. So hey, I'm glad to have you here and glad that everybody can join us. So I invited you, Leslea, on to talk about poetry and writing, and you have so much, it's such a breadth of experience. You've been involved in so many amazing books that we all know and love, children's books, including your own. And I was so thrilled when I saw that you are participating in a book launch group I'm in and saw you there. I'm like, wow, because I shared with you as part of my journey, I had participated in a highlights virtual camp during the pandemic that you led a session on writing poetry. And for me, I was always kind of intimidated. I've always loved poetry, but going through the exercises that you had with us helped me feel more confident in writing lyrically and using different poetic devices and things in my writing. And then when I would go to other webinars and get information, I saw that some of my favorite authors had also learned from you. And then you even shared that a poetry class I took, you taught the teacher of the class. So I'm like, wow, she is someone who has a breadth of knowledge. But can you share a little bit about your background, more about your background to people who are tuning in?
Sure. So I've been writing poetry actually since I was 8 years old when my family moved from Brooklyn to Long Island. And I was very, very sad for many reasons, including that my grandmother stayed behind in Brooklyn, which isn't that far, but instead of being across the street, she was 45 minutes away. So no one said to me, why don't you write some poetry about that? It'll make you feel better. But somehow, organically, I just knew how to do that, that would help me cope with this loss. And so that's how it all started. And then my first publications were actually some poems in 17 magazine when I was a teenager.
Oh,
And yep. And I just never looked back. So I started as a poet writing poetry for adults, basically, which I still do. But now I also write poetry for children and children's book written in verse. And poetry really is my main love. I just love poetry.
right. And how can we, even if you write in prose, is it something that's beneficial for writers? Why is it so important for us to be aware of different poetic devices?
So I think poets make the best prose writers. I think everybody, whatever you're writing, and even if you're writing something that might be very dry, like academic work, or if you're a journalist, still, what poetry teaches you is to love language. And that's our tool. So you can use poetic devices, as you mentioned, such as repetition, alliteration, rhythm, sometimes rhyme, just to really enrich your writing. Because however you're telling a story in prose or in poetry, you're creating a work of art. And the tools of poetry will help you create a work of art.
Yeah, and that's what really attracted me to writing in picture books because I had self-published some chapter books before I wrote my picture book that's upcoming, They Built Me for Freedom, the story of Juneteenth in Houston's Emancipation Park. And for me, it was wanting to create a work of art because I see the picture books as a work of art, many of them. I mean, some are funny, some are different things, but especially the lyrical ones it was something that I felt like, well, I don't know how to do this. And after I took your class, I had been trying to write picture books and wrote some terrible ones. And then it helped me learn, different things that I could do in that time. Or
So
I don't know how. I don't know. But
we have all written terrible picture books. Those are the ones that stay in the drawer, right? But
yes.
the kind of the irony is the only way to learn how to write a book is to write a book. There's no other way to learn it, really. And well, and reading, of course, is very, very important. So, we just have to practice and practice and practice until we get things right. But I think poetry and picture books, again, whether you're writing in verse or not, have so many similarities. For example, in a picture book, you have the page turn, right? And that can build suspense, that can give the reader a place to pause. And it's the same with poetry. You have a line break or a stanza break that just gives you that little breath to sit back before you move on. So those are some of the things that are really, at least one thing that's very similar between the two forms.
Okay. Now, when I took it was like an hour-long
Mhm.
session that you ran. You had us doing some exercises, and I don't really, it's been years since I did them, but you had us using different poetic forms and then writing. So can you give us some examples of ways people can practice to help improve their poetry writing skills?
Well, I think it's really important to learn how to write in forms such as sonnets, sestinas, villanelles, and a lot of people are very intimidated by that. But I think of it as just playing with language. And I try to really not have a expectation in mind that this is going to turn into a finished publishable poem. I mean, it might, but if you just think about this as play, and online now you could just type in formal poetry, poetic forms, and you can just find a gazillion examples and instruction, and just pick something that appeals to you, whether it's haiku, right, which is even though it's a simple form, it's not that easy to write, or a sonnet, which has a rhyme scheme that's a little more involved. But just try that, and even if nothing happens that you think is successful, which I might argue with, it opens up your mind to the possibilities of different ways to use language. And that's what poetry can do for you.
Right. I need to practice that because it is where I want something that's going to be published, and then I'm like, oh, but I guess it's kind of like exercising your muscle with the poems.
Well, that's how I feel like if I write, I try to write every day. I don't always, but I try to. And let's say for 25 days, the writing just isn't going well, nothing is working, nothing is even forming. But on the 26th day, something interesting happens. So those first 25 days were not a failure. I needed those to loosen up my mind, to just work through, like you say, kind of exercising my muscles to build up to that 26th day where something is on the page that I think, oh, this is interesting. I'm going to work with this and it might turn into something. So nothing is wasted.
Right. Now, something I wanted to ask you about when I took the other course, it was through a woman named Renee Latulippe, and she talks about rhyme crimes. And I've done some mentoring with other authors that are interested in writing picture books. I had to read through many manuscripts, and I noticed some of the things she called rhyme crimes. Could you talk about that, or things people need to watch out for when they're attempting to write in rhyme?
Well, first of all, I love that phrase, rhyme crime. I'm going to steal that from Renee, who, as you know, I was her mentor. So you see, the students always teach the teachers,
Yeah,
always. So, people, it seems to me that they don't have that much trouble with the rhyme. So anyone can rhyme cat, hat, bat, etc. But what people have trouble with is the meter and
right,
the accents and the stresses. So when you write something, you know how you want it to sound, right? And so if you read it out loud, you're going to kind of fudge your way and make it sound the way you want it to sound. So I think a good thing to do is to let somebody else read it to you,
right,
and then you're going to hear where things are off, because they're not living in your mind. They don't know how you want it to read. They just see what's on the page.
right.
But I'm a stickler for perfect rhyme. So I know there is such a thing, of course, as slant rhyme. Emily Dickinson said, tell it slant. But like things grate on my ear, like mine and time, you know, that N and M that people try to force to rhyme. It doesn't rhyme.
Mhm.
So those are the kind of things that I watch out for. And also it's really important to try and find some original rhymes that haven't been used before rather than the same old tired rhymes. But I'm going to actually ask Renee what her rhyme crimes are. Now I'm curious.
Right. And when you're talking about the tired old rhymes, especially, and then she talked about how people will invert sentences to make them
Oh, that's a
rhyme.
big crime.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not the way you're talking, it's not flowing like normal conversation, but they've inverted it. And then she also talked about the story, the rhyme leading the story.
Yeah, that's very common when, you know, because I mentor people privately, and I those two things happen all the time, that people invert sentences because they're just looking for that end rhyme, and it just nobody talks like that, so it doesn't work. And a lot of people, in fact, I just yesterday got a wonderful email from a student who said, I was writing this verse novel, and you, meaning me, told me to take it out of verse and write it in prose. And guess what? I got it published. So thank you for that tough love.
Oh,
So you see,
oh.
sometimes you got to let it go.
Right. Now, I have a question about verse novels. Yeah, while I've got you on here, I had attempted to write a verse novel and I had to put it aside because I've been struggling. I found things came to me out of order. And then it's gotten bigger and bigger and it's just so much. But is that typical or when I was writing it?
Well, that's very interesting. You know, there's no right way to write a novel. So some people write chronologically, which is what I tend to do, but some people write in pieces like that, and then weave it all together. So, you know, it's really a very intuitive thing, whatever works for you.
Right. Because when I write in prose, I write
Hmm.
chronologically, but with that, I was just coming up with different things. But then it made it even more difficult to get things organized.
Yeah. Well, you know, one thing I would ask myself if I was writing a verse novel, and I have written one, is why am I writing this as a verse novel? What is the advantage? What is writing in verse bringing to this story? Why can't I write it in prose? And there has to be a compelling reason. So, for example, I have a verse novel called October Morning, a song from Matthew Shepard, which explores the hate crime that uh, robbed Matthew Shepard of his life. And what I did was, because nobody really knows what happened the night he was killed, because he can't tell us, and his killers, I don't particularly believe that they tell the truth. I thought, well, what if the other witnesses could tell me what happened at the fence where he was attacked? So, what if the fence spoke? What if the trees around him spoke? What if the moon
Ooh.
over him spoke? What if the deer who came by spoke? So, that's poetry.
Oh,
So
that's
that's why that book was written in poetry, because I had all these other ways of approaching this story, which I could not do in prose.
right. And that's such a tough topic. So I find that when things like that happen, he was killed because of a hate crime, then those seem to lend themselves more to verse too, don't they?
I think so. And also for me, when I'm dealing with something that's very intensely emotional, I often write in form, because the form is the container that holds the emotion. Because if there was no form, it would just kind of be very unwieldy and all over the place. So this gives me something, a form I can pour the emotion in, and it can hold it. And so that tension between emotion and form, something happens in that tension that makes the poem work, makes the poem come alive.
Now, Leslie, you've written over 80 books, is that
That is
right? And you have
right.
two more coming out. Two
Yes.
more. So how do you, with ideas, do they just continue to come, or how do you keep your well filled for your
Well,
creativity?
as a friend of mine says, I go to the idea store. So, which I wish existed, because, you know, everyone laughs when I say this, but it's true. I have a very hard time coming up with ideas. Once I have an idea, I just pester it to death until I really am satisfied. But ideas come to me from dreams, from everyday experience, from reading a lot, from stories people tell me, from just everywhere, though they are slow. to come to me. But once I have an idea, it really moves pretty quickly.
Right, because you have so many different books on all these different topics. And are most of your books written in lyrical styles, or does it run the gamut?
I would say about half of them, but even my prose, I like to think of poetic. I certainly use poetic devices when I'm writing prose. For example, my newest children's book, Joyful Song, a naming story, it's about a family, two moms and their son and their baby daughter walking to synagogue where the baby's naming ceremony will take place. And on the way, they meet one neighbor who asks a question and they answer it. And then they meet the second neighbor who asks a variation of that question. So there's a variation of the answer and so on. And that's poetry, right? It has a refrain, it has a repeating pattern, it has the concept of three. So even if I write, or when I write in prose, it hopefully sounds a bit like poetry.
Right. And I guess you've just been doing this so many years and you're an expert in all these different aspects of poetry. So I guess we got to roll up our sleeves and work if we want things to
Absolutely,
turn that way.
absolutely. Yes, and maybe some people should know that my poems go through like 20, 25, 30 drafts. So I recently had someone say to me, I just read a poem of yours and it's like it just effortlessly flowed upon the page. And I thought, oh, I wish.
Right.
My job is to make it read easily,
Right.
but there's
Right.
a lot of work that goes behind that. It's kind of like when you put your makeup on, you're supposed to look just gorgeous, but like not that you have any makeup on. And if people only knew the hours that were spent in front of that mirror, it's like that.
And get a filter. We
Yeah,
get now.
yeah.
Put a filter on. Yeah. But that is very interesting to me. And something that I found as I've started writing more picture books and writing more lyrical things is it when I'm writing prose, it was harder going back to prose
Huh.
for me. So that was interesting because I'm going through each word and making it really sparse. So I wasn't writing as many descriptions, or it wasn't when I went back to trying to attempt a longer novel form. They were saying my critique group was saying, well, you're underwriting, you need to put more
Oh,
description in there.
that is interesting because poetry is like is similar to picture books in a way that you have very few words to tell a
Right,
story. So yeah, and then also you can rely a lot on the illustrations in a picture book, but
right.
in prose you have so much room. You could really load it up with telling images. Not just images for the sake of images, but the telling detail. That's what's important in prose.
But then a lot of times they continue to say you need to show, not tell.
Mm-hmm.
So then how do you know which one to do? But I guess you've got to have description if you're writing a prose novel. They need to know they don't have pictures, so they've got to see
Right.
what's
Yeah. No,
there.
the descriptions are very important. And again, you can use poetic devices like metaphor and simile, those comparisons, which can really enrich your writing and also develop character.
Right. Now, do you have any texts that you recommend people read to learn more about poetry or different things,
You know, I
resources?
I think for me, the best way to learn about poetry is to just read good poetry. So, I know there are a lot of craft books and textbooks, and they are helpful to some people. For me, what's more helpful is just really immersing myself in poems. So, find something like, the best poetry of 2023 and go through that book. And then if you find a poem you particularly like, look that poet up. They probably have a book and you can get a whole book of that person's poetry and study that person, see what compels you, why are you emotionally responding to this particular poem, and go from there. That's what I suggest.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna do that because I love poem like Langston Hughes and some of the older poets. And then with my children, I have three kids. They used to recite different poetry at our church, especially during Black History Month. They would do different times where they had to learn different speeches and read Maya Angelou or recite different poems. And I always loved those poems. and love just hearing that language.
It's a wonderful thing to memorize poetry. And then it's like you always have a friend with you.
Right, right. So even talking to you has encouraged me to read more. I don't read a lot of modern, I'm not familiar with a lot of modern poetry, so I may delve into that a little bit more to help me.
There's also a lot of daily poetry listservs that you can get on, where they send you a poem a day. And I find that a wonderful way to start my morning.
Right.
Read a poem. I don't always love the poem, but sometimes I do, or it's always interesting. And maybe even just start writing after that. Use it as a prompt and see what happens.
Okay, right. Well, this has been very enlightening and inspiring for me in making me know I need to get to work and do a little more to improve with my skills with poetry. But you mentioned your upcoming book. I think you had another book. Do you want to tell us about that and tell people where they can connect with you and your work?
So I actually had two books come out this spring. One is called Joyful Song and Naming Story, which is, as I said, a two-mom family and their son and their new baby girl going off to synagogue for a naming ceremony. And then I have a book called Like Father, Like Son, which just came out, and that is actually told in rhyming verse.
Mm.
And it is a celebration of fathers and sons and all the ways that fathers can be gentle and kind and compassionate with their boy children.
Okay. So is that coming out around Father's Day or?
Uh, that
Mm,
came out in April, but
mm.
it would make a great Father's Day gift for families that do have fathers.
Right, right. So, hey, that's good. And then your other one, Mother's Day, Father's
Right.
Day,
Well, yeah,
anytime.
Joyful Song could definitely be a Mother's Day gift.
Right, right. Well, I want to thank you for joining me. I'm trying to think if I have any other questions. Any other tips for people wanting to improve as poets or tips on
Um,
using these devices in their
yeah,
writing?
I really recommend studying form. I know I said that, so it's not a new tip, but take a form and just like count the syllables in the word, see where the rhymes happen, see where the lines repeat, and just as an exercise, write in that manner and just see what you learn from it. And then if you want to go back to writing in free verse, fine. But something inside of you might change. So I really, really recommend learning form. I like to say if it was good enough for Shakespeare, it's good enough for me.
Yes, yes. Okay. Well, thank you for taking this time. Thank you for getting on Instagram Live. So you're ready to go live every week now, aren't you?
I
You
mean, yeah, I thank you so much for being so patient with me and teaching me how to do this. I really appreciate it.
Yes. And thank you everybody for joining us. I hope that you got some great tips that can help you with your writing. And we'll see you next week for another episode. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.